Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. In the studio with me today, I have Isaac Lake. Isaac is one of my coaching clients here in Memphis, Tennessee, who recently transitioned from his career in nonprofit to for-profit. Isaac, thanks for joining me, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. Congratulations on your big transition.
Thank you.
And on your new baby that you had at the same time.
I know, like everything at once, right?
Yeah, it seems like kind of, when it rains, it pours, I guess.
Right, in a good way.
But all good things.
Right,
yeah.
absolutely.
So I really wanted to bring you on today because I think the thing about you that really stood out to me was how open you were to trying new things and trying things that maybe were a little uncomfortable and different. And I think it really showed that sometimes when you try things that are different, it can work out in your favor. And so that's what I'm hoping, we can share with the listeners today.
Great, thanks.
Cool. So I guess let's start off with your previous job because you did make a pretty big transition. What were you doing and where were you working?
I was a manager for facilities and programs with the University of Memphis. I've been there about 8 years. I guess probably the simplest way to describe it is I was kind of an operations general manager type position. Managed every aspect of everything that happened within that organization that went from running any one of the events. We did about 6,500 to 7,000 events a year. Buying furniture, ordering carpet, all sorts of things that go with managing a large multi-purpose facility, and also coordinating things with we had 6 restaurants on site, working with them, working with our catering vendors to maximize, our success and managing a very large team. We had, at one time, we had as many as 50 employees on our staff. I think when I left, we were down to about 42.
And did those people report to you?
A large portion of them did, either directly or indirectly. And some of that also involves supervising or coordinating with people that I didn't directly supervise, like our general maintenance and I already mentioned kind of the restaurant people. They didn't report directly to me, but I had, some responsibility in making sure that they had what they needed in the facility and doing all that sort of thing. So it was a very, very busy job.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was, of course, in education. And now you've transitioned to a new role that's in corporate, and you're with Hilton now.
Right.
And tell me a little bit about that role.
Well, this job I'm really excited about it. Let me say that on the front end. It's a senior manager for brand development, and what I'll be doing is working very closely with ownership groups to build new hotels in new markets, to kind of focus on growing the revenue in existing markets, working with underperforming organizations as well to try to bring them up to brand standard, things of that nature. But it's much more of a forward-thinking kind of position, looking at how can we grow the business, how can we be successful on a national scale, and this for a national brand, so it's a really big jump.
Oh, it's really exciting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it's a lot different than kind of what you were doing
Very,
before.
very different, yeah. I mean, there's some components of what I did that are applicable, but a lot of what I'll be doing on a day-to-day basis is significantly different.
Well, the good thing is you had a lot of transferable skills that you could take over with you. So from a high level, can you kind of walk me through the process that you went through to find this new job?
Right. Yeah, so I started actually a couple years ago and thinking about wanting to do something different. I think I've told you before I wanted to stay in Memphis.
Right.
We've got family in the area, and just there's a lot of perks to being in the Memphis area. But I sort of felt like I was beating my head against the wall. I kept trying to get in with different entities throughout the city that I thought, hey, there might be some stuff here where what I do transitions or they make sense to them, and I just was not having any success. So probably about 6 months ago, I made the decision to contact you and try to do something different. Not just kind of throwing resumes at jobs anymore, but being really specific, almost like surgical in my approach.
So when you were looking before, were you applying online, or like how were you going about it?
Most of it was like just, you see a job, you think this looks great, you send in a resume and a cover letter, and you hope it makes it through the crapshoot.
Right.
And what I found was that I wasn't being very, very successful. I wasn't even getting phone calls, for opportunities to even interview, much less, go to that next step. And so a lot of my job search at that time was literally just like looking on your typical career builder or Monster or even the newspaper, seeing a job that might look kind of something I might somewhat be interested in, and then just sending in those documents and hoping for the best.
Yeah, so as you kind of started the process with me, what did you do that was sort of different?
Meaning when I started with you?
Yeah, I mean, how did you go about finding a job from sort of that point forward that was maybe different than just applying online? And what did you sort of learn from that?
Well, I would tell you the first thing that I did was I decided I was going to just have to throw out everything and start all over and just do this in a completely new and different way, because what I realized that what I was doing was not having any success. And for me to find some success, I was going to have to try doing something different and opening my mind to new ideas. And so that involved a lot of going about a job search in a completely new and different way. And that, for me, meant a lot of conversations with people, finding out about what they did,
Right.
Almost like in a conversational way, not in an interview way, but like just sitting down with somebody, trying to find out what did they like about their job,
Right.
and was this something that I could ever see myself doing, but not going into it with the focus of finding a job, but going into it with the focus of building a network and meeting new people.
So when you went through this whole process, what was different than what you were expecting, like on the front end? Was there anything that was kind of unusual?
With going through the new process?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was really impressed at how open people were.
Yeah.
So when you sit down with somebody and it's not a structured meeting, it's not an interview, and you're just trying to find out about what they like about their job, people are really open about that. They'll tell you what they like, what they don't like, what a typical day looks like, and they'll try to relate to you. I had lots of conversations over coffee where people would just be like, halfway through the conversation, they would start to almost interview me to find out what I did and how I might fit in with their organization. And it was unintentional on my part.
Right.
Because I was just there to talk to them about what they did. And so the openness was really surprising. People were very candid, kind of tell you what's great, what's not great. But then, like I said, on the back end, I almost got interviewed every single time I went out and had one of these conversations, because people would want to know what you did and try to find out about you. I mean, it's natural in conversation, but you don't really think about it in that setting.
I remember at least one or two opportunities that you kind of came upon on accident during one of these meetings.
Right.
Where it was almost like the meeting stopped and the person was like, by the way,
Right.
I'd like to maybe hire you.
Right, yeah. There was at least two opportunities. One was at another nonprofit here in Memphis, and the gentleman I was speaking with was just a great guy, and he's like, look, you would actually be really good at this job. You should think about applying. And had a great conversation. It ended up not being the right fit for me at the time, but it was definitely different.
That's really cool. I think sometimes when people go about their job search process, you would assume that other people might not be open to meeting with you, especially if they're not people that you already know.
Right.
So I think that's a really good point, that people are sometimes more open than you might expect if you just ask them to sit down with you.
No, I absolutely agree. I can't get over still to this point how open people were and how just friendly and welcoming almost everybody I talked to was. They just made it a point to keep you focused and find out as much as they could about you at the same time. So it was really, really impressive.
Oh, that's good. So I remember there was some point at which we were talking and you hit like a frustration point.
Right.
And it was there was just a time where you just weren't really sure. What was frustrating at that point, and kind of how did you kind of get through that?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I did get to a point where I was just like, oh my gosh, I've been, in context, for 2 years almost before you and I even started talking, where I'm just feel like I use the analogy again, beating your head against the wall, where you're just trying to make something happen. It's not happening. And, I got to that point, I guess it was, when did we talk? I think back in March. So 3 months into our process, where I was just like, it doesn't feel like this is working. I'm getting frustrated. I need to move forward. And, I think I even may have talked to you about some of my, the challenges with being, having a family and wanting to be able to do all of the things that, you think a 20-something that doesn't have a family can do, like the networking after hours and being able to spend every single lunch meeting a new individual. And I just didn't, my position at the time didn't really allow for that. And then by the time I got home, I wanted to spend that time with my family, my downtime with the family. And so, I really, at that point, you and I started to discuss some alternative ways to network and taking advantage of early mornings, for example, and taking advantage of that, those lunch opportunities when I could make them. And it really paid off for me.
That's really good. I think the important point, too, to take away is that you were pretty specific in what you wanted. You wanted to stay in Memphis. We were looking within a certain salary range. And for certain types of positions in order for it to actually make sense for you to change.
Right.
And I think as you get more specific in those kind of requirements, sometimes it takes, longer.
Right. I mean, that was an important point that I took away from that is, I wasn't looking for a $35,000 a year job. If I was looking for one of those, they're pretty easy. Or, I mean, you can find one of those, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I was looking at definitely a different income bracket. And that sort of search takes quite a bit longer than a manager at a fast food chain, for example.
So how long did your search end up taking?
From the time you and I started working, just under 6 months.
Okay.
So, but I think I remember I circled that date of May 1 on my calendar, and May 2nd I had a job offer.
Right.
So.
It was the day after.
Right, it was the day after. So you missed it by one day.
One day,
so.
I know. Almost. So what do you think? I mean, this was a huge transition for you.
Right.
You went from nonprofit to corporate, from education to a franchise-based business, and your role is really different. I mean, what do you think was sort of the key in your success? I mean, that what you did differently that made you able to do that transition?
Well, the key, there's a couple things. I think perseverance is one. I think another is being willing to try to do something in a different way was key. I mean, the results I was getting before and the results I started getting after I started trying a new approach were completely different. I also think being open to challenging myself to think differently was also very important, because one of the things that we talked about quite a bit is, the value that you bring to an organization, figuring out how to articulate that information to somebody new and communicating it almost in a different way. It's not like, because I'll go back, one of the things I was really challenged by is that, in my old role, working in a nonprofit organization, we use a lot of language that's very, very specific.
Yeah.
And so it may not relate well outside of higher ed, for example. A lot of the stuff that we talk about, people kind of glaze over when they look at me like, what does that even mean? So figuring out how to take that language and change it to, I guess, something that's more broadly applicable to across a wide range of organizations, it was really key as well.
I think that's a really important point, because a lot of people, no matter which industry they're in and what their job function is, they use very specific language.
Right.
And you put them into a room with different people who have different types of jobs, and sometimes they don't know how to explain what they do. And the other people, there's just a sort of a lack of information there. I mean, you have to work as sort of your own translator to translate it into a language that they understand. And I think it's sometimes good to maybe call a family member, call your grandmother, see who you can explain it to that has no relation to your field at all. Because it's both being able to explain it, but also being comfortable to talk about why you're great and what you bring. Because sometimes people also have a tendency to not want to brag about themselves.
Right.
But when you go through the interview process, that sort of bragging is what allows you to articulate what you bring to this new job. And
Right.
if you're doing something really different, it's kind of unclear unless you are able to demonstrate that.
Absolutely. That's another thing that I really had to work on that I'd never done before is the whole idea of an elevator pitch and being able to talk about, highlight some really key things that I'd done in, 30 seconds in a way that would make sense. And I actually had an opportunity 2 or 3 months after you and I started talking to do that in an elevator with a guy. That
Really?
Yeah, this is so random. But just to talk about everything that I had done. And, we ended up, he gave me his card when we left, said, hey, let's go have lunch. And, I did follow up. It ended up being something I wasn't interested in. But practicing that elevator pitch over and over again, like you said, to my dad, to my brother down in Florida, to whoever would listen, to my best friend out in Lakeland, just constantly talking about and trying to perfect that elevator pitch and get it to where, it just came off like that, and it was sharp.
Yeah, and
So.
the better that you get at your elevator pitch, you can sort of tweak it depending on the person.
Right.
Because if it's really smooth, then if you meet someone in a different industry, it's not that hard to sort of change it up just a little. But if you haven't practiced and you're starting totally from scratch and they're in a different industry, I mean, it can be really challenging.
Right.
For sure. So was it as hard? I feel like when we first talked, the idea of transitioning to corporate, it was a bit of an unknown thing. I remember, I think we reviewed some job descriptions, and the titles were really different.
Right.
I don't remember if it was maybe a director level title at one point we reviewed or a manager. And I know, say, at a university setting, that person would have so many employees.
Right.
But in a corporate setting, they might have much fewer employees.
Right.
I mean, was it as hard to sort of make that transition over to corporate as what you were anticipating in your mind?
Well, I'll say for starters, it was initially very overwhelming, because you think about I've been doing something for 10 years, and to look at trying to do something completely different, the amount of things that are out there, you're looking at all these different companies, and it just feels really overwhelming, all the different things that you could look at. And once I got past that and became more comfortable with the idea of transitioning into thinking about things differently, because I think was the most important thing for me, is I had to change the way I thought about it. So it became all of a sudden not overwhelming and suddenly exciting to think about it. Does that make sense? So,
No, it does, yeah.
So I went from, oh my gosh, do I want to work for one of these 65 different companies that might have a job here in Memphis, to, hey, let's look really at job description and what makes sense, and would I really enjoy this? Would it be a good fit? And once I made that transition in my mind, I don't want to say it became easy, but at least it felt much more natural.
Yeah. So was there any part of your own experience that was valued inside of a corporation that you weren't expecting? Like, I know part of this job that you got was actually based on something you were kind of doing on the side.
Right.
It was more of, I don't want to say a hobby, but it definitely wasn't your full-time gig.
Sure. Yeah, so, about 5 years ago, I started to challenge myself to do things differently outside of, my current job. And that meant
Right.
I started buying and selling real estate, working with small businesses, worked with a friend to establish a 24-hour fitness franchise, just a variety of different business types that I started working with. And with the idea at the time was just kind of, at first it literally did start as a hobby. I was like, I could do this. And then I realized I was actually kind of good at it and could make some money doing it. And so I started doing all that, and it got to a point, like specifically with Hilton Worldwide, that was a more almost of a focus than the actual my work experience, because they're like, oh, so you know how to bring ownership groups together, and how to raise money, and how to raise capital, and how to project profit and loss, and do all of this sort of thing. Well, you'd be a great fit for working with ownership groups of hotels. And so that experience was in a large part due or responsible for how I ended up getting this position.
Yeah, and I don't think we put initially a ton of focus on your resume around this thing, because we were focused more on, your full-time job with the
Right.
university,
Right.
more than, sort of the side work or side projects that you were doing.
Right.
But I think it's oftentimes those side projects or hobbies or interests that can allow you to make like a big transition, because
Right.
there are areas where you're developing expertise outside of your, your normal job, and you're really sort of taking ownership over your future when you do those things. You're not
Right.
just waiting, on your current full-time employer to teach you something
Sure.
new. You're saying, I have an interest in this, I'm going to pursue it. And then later down the road, it was recognized, and now you're doing something very similar as your full-time job.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that we talked about when you and I first started working together was, I go back to thinking about it differently, but I had to redo my resume almost completely because I had never thought, for example, to put on my leadership experience or the LLC. It was never even on my resume. So when I went to apply for jobs, it wasn't even a factor. They didn't consider it. But then when I started thinking about, and you and I discussing, all of these things and how they provided value, I realized, hey, maybe instead of this just being like a side gig, let's highlight this, because this is really important. This is something I'm actually really proud of, that I built with my own two hands, so to speak. And we changed my resume around quite a bit to make that more of a focus, as opposed to the nonprofit experience. And that, again, just goes back to thinking about it differently and not being so regimented in, this is the way my job experience looks and this is the way it's going to look on paper. So,
I think it's also very trial and error.
right, exactly.
I mean, it's not like you redid your resume once and it was perfect and you walked away. You made iterations to that resume, and you met with different people, and not every person had the perfect job. It was a process. I think it's a very organic process where you're talking to people, making changes, and kind of, going back and forth in terms of, what can I learn from this person? What can I take away from it? So what is the one thing that, you've taken away from this whole process that you will plan to use in the future when eventually one day in 30 years that you have decided to look for another job? I mean, what's sort of the one piece that's really stuck out to you?
I mean, there's so many different things that stand out, but I think the overall component is just being open to trying new things. And just because it doesn't feel natural to you doesn't mean that you can't do it. And so, I'll go back again to those sitting down with somebody that you've never met before and having a conversation about what they do for a living. Was completely foreign idea to me. I mean, meeting with a complete stranger, and outside of a normal networking scenario where everybody's trying to meet everybody and passing out business cards and stuff of that nature, it was very foreign to me. And that it goes back to that first thought where you had to be open to trying something new, and you had to be open to just not necessarily reinventing yourself, but thinking about everything that you did in a very focused and almost surgical way. You use the term like I can't remember how you described it, but focusing it on the individual that you're meeting with, and sorry, I lost my train of
Yeah, it's
thought
kind of
there.
like painting the picture of where you want to be.
But you are exactly. That's what I was trying
And
to say.
painting it for other people so they can see it. Because
Right.
today all they see is where you are. So had you been just pitching, your old role, you would have probably found a really great job at another
Right.
university,
Right.
which would have easily happened. But you decided you wanted to do something different. And so it was kind of creating this new brand.
Right.
It's a new brand of Isaac that, on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile, everything screams out something slightly different. It's all
Right.
accurate, it's all
Right.
true, but it's a different angle of who you are that maybe other people weren't considering before, is kind of how I look at it.
No, you're exactly right. That almost building a personal brand. And, we talked about that quite a bit, how everything, I mean, your LinkedIn, even your Facebook and all that stuff, it goes into building your personal brand, and your job experience is definitely a part of that. And we really, really focused on that, worked hard on it, and, blood, sweat, and tears, so to speak.
Yeah.
But, it paid off in the end, just really thinking about things in a different way.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that one thing that was a bit of a struggle was the networking piece because, you're a dad and you're a husband and you were managing up to 50 people. There was just a lot going on in your life.
Right.
Many people tend to go to networking events in the evening.
Sure.
That sort of thing was really challenging.
Right.
So you kind of touched on it a little bit, but, what would you recommend for someone that's in that situation and just can't seem to find the time, like at night, to go to an event?
Well, one of the things that I learned from you learned from this process as well, is that, looking for that kind of position is almost another full-time job. And if you can commit to, I'm going to do this for 6 months with the understanding of you got to balance your family and your other work schedule and all of that sort of thing. But, once you start to put that goal out there and put, not a solid time frame, but at least some sort of, I'm going to really push this for this amount of time. It's almost like you give yourself a light at the end of the tunnel from the beginning, and so it makes it a little easier to have to focus on networking more after hours and having those conversations over lunch with individuals and making time in your schedule. It also helps, your family as well, because they also see that there's some bigger picture at work here, and that at the end of, this sort of timetable, we're going to be in a different place, and you'll have some more time to focus on your family and do things of that nature. So I'm not saying in any way that, you push everybody back to the side, but you do have to kind of prioritize a little bit and realize that this is what's going to be good for your family in the end, and while still balancing all of the things that you have to balance. So there was a lot, it's hard. It is really hard doing all of that, but in the end, I think it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely. It's so interesting because I think a lot of folks, they're not happy with their job,
Right.
but then they're not really willing to put the time in.
Right.
And you're really the only person that can make a difference in your own job search process. I mean, if you're just going to wait for somebody to throw something at you, you're going to get leftovers. So
Right.
it's kind of, you have to be proactive. You have to sort of be like the CEO of your own job search
Right.
to really make a difference. So I know another piece that we covered through our process together was negotiation.
Right.
And I remember, I think we probably had a conversation about how early negotiation can start.
That's right.
And I think it often, and I think this happened with multiple interviews that you had, where many times negotiation starts in the very first phone call or the very
Right.
first contact. Did you find that to be the case, and was that a surprise to you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the nonprofit or higher education world, salary ranges are predetermined. Before you even go into the door, they're telling you, here's the range of the salary. Mm-hmm. So we're not even going to talk to you if you don't fit within this range. So going into a corporate setting where you may have some sort of idea, but you really don't, was initially very intimidating, and definitely a learning experience. I think it was also kind of almost shocking in a way, like how direct, particularly human resources professionals were, with trying to get figures out of you and asking really, really uncomfortable questions
Right.
about, like, how much do you make now, and how much vacation just asking everything, trying to get as much information from you as they could about where you're currently at, so they could put a price tag on you. Mm-hmm. And that was completely foreign to me and very uncomfortable.
Right.
But I felt like after having some conversations about it, I felt pretty well prepared to handle those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, my advice typically to my clients is that you want to avoid giving a number as long as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens is that you don't expect negotiation to happen until much later.
Right.
So you're maybe not quite prepared. And that very first phone call, often when the HR person calls you to schedule an interview, they start asking you these questions. And I think often the interviewer feels that if they don't answer those questions, that they might not move forward in the process.
Right.
And that's true. Sometimes you won't move forward. But typically you can kind of give answers like, my current job is really different. I don't know that the salaries translate well, or, I'm just not comfortable sharing that right now. or you can even ask them their range. And I think that's pretty shocking because often, gosh, I'd say 8 times out of 10, the HR person will give you their range. And often in corporate, that range is quite wide. I mean, it could be $20,000 or $30,000 wide.
Right.
And so what you give as an answer about what is your current salary could put you at the bottom of the range, or it could put you at the top of the range. And it's like a 5-minute conversation, although totally uncomfortable, that can make a huge difference in your entire like pay history going forward.
Right.
And so I think it is shocking. It's surprising how uncomfortable that conversation is.
Right.
I've even encountered interviewers who enjoy that it's so uncomfortable. They try to sort of push the buttons, and they enjoy that. It's typically when it's the hiring manager asking, I've found, rather than the HR person. The HR person is doing it because they've kind of been put up to it.
Right.
That's part of their job.
Right.
Versus the hiring manager is getting some kind of joy out of like watching you squirm a little bit. But I think you did a really fantastic job with your sort of negotiation process and how you went through it. And I know for you, it was really different because, like you said, you were in higher education before, and the process was totally different. So I guess walking away from it, I mean, do you feel satisfied that it went well for you? And I mean, that you were able to successfully negotiate even though it was a really different process?
Yeah, I do. I think, I was really, again, taken aback initially. There was a couple of different conversations that I had revolving salary and other benefits, and I came away from it happy with where I'm at. I think that, being very vague served me well, talking about the differences, like you said, between how what I did may not translate to what you're wanting me to do. Initially, the HR person gave me one figure, and then they gave me another figure, and then they came back with a third figure. And I think that, and I never gave them a number at all. So I think that process really served me well, being very, not necessarily avoiding the question, but deflecting almost.
Yeah, because, I mean, really you're having a conversation about, does it make sense in your work environment? Like, is this position worth that much to you? And is it worth that much to me to move over? Because it's a giant pain to leave a job. I mean, you've learned how to do it. You've been doing it for like 10 years. The company that you're leaving, like the university, now has to find a replacement. You have to learn a new job. It totally shakes up your routine. So it really has to work for both parties. And I typically think of it a little bit like dating in that it's not a one-sided discussion. It's two-sided. Does this work for me, and does this work for you? And so I think that's really smart. And I think, you mentioned being open. I recently interviewed another person who's been incredibly successful in their career. And the thing that surprised me, it was not someone I've worked with before, but I kept asking them, what made a difference for you? What made you more successful? And they kept saying, I was open to trying new things. I was open when someone approached me about a job that I hadn't thought about. I was open to thinking about things differently. And that's kind of the message that I'm getting from you as well. And I see that too with, sometimes with other people that I speak with. I may make a recommendation and they might say, I absolutely refuse to do that. I won't try that. That doesn't make sense. And I think being closed, you kind of stay in the same place that you're in. I think that being open was a big thing. So what in your whole process did you try that was really uncomfortable and different for you than what you have done before? Was it the negotiation, or what? I mean, what was just the most sort of uncomfortable thing to get over?
I think, yes, salary negotiation was definitely one of the most uncomfortable things. I think, going from higher ed where they give you a range and you're going to fall within that range, it's just easy almost when you're negotiating salary in that context. But having to deal with, not only are you balancing their HR, but in my case, it was a contractor for HR that was actually charged with negotiating your salary on the front end. That sort of thing was very, very different and challenging. some of the interview process was also very different, and it wasn't necessarily uncomfortable, but it was like just new in the way they approach things. You know, in higher ed and in nonprofits in general, people can tend to be very, we use the phrase touchy-feely in our language, but just like really gentle in the way they ask questions and almost like leading interview questions and things that are designed to make you very successful. And when you walk in and sit in front of a guy that's like, he's clearly really, really busy and has got 16 minutes to talk to you, and he asks you about 5 questions, you better get those questions right. So, because they're very direct and very intentional, and they don't, you can tell that they're not there to mess around. And so that was very different than the interview experience that I'm used to.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, corporate is just such a different environment.
Right.
You know, their whole goal in corporate is to, you know, make revenue, you know, have profit, and versus in higher education, you're developing people, you want people to improve and to really grow. And so I could see how the personalities would be very different that you'd interact with, and how the experience would feel very different. So it's a great observation. Do you have any other advice other than kind of what we've touched on that, you know, you would offer to our listeners?
You know, other than, like, you know, I said be open, be willing to try whatever. You know, I got to a point where I was just like, I don't care if this is going to be super embarrassing. I'm going to try it, you know, because if it works, you know, am I going to look back and be like, I was embarrassed for 5 minutes, or am I going to look back and be like, this was a fantastic experience? Yeah. And so that's what I did, is I was willing to try anything, you know, within reason, of course. But I was very, you know, I keep using the term open, but that's because I mean it. I was very open to trying new things.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. You were a really fun person to work with because of that openness. Well, thank you, Isaac, for joining me today. This discussion has been super helpful for our listeners, and thank you to everyone for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.